الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. We have been looking at the distinction between theology philosophy and theology. The theologian, on the other hand, although he certainly uses his reason, accepts his principles on authority. Well, there are a lot of principles which philosopher also accepts on authority, background assumptions, etc. Maybe a philosopher doesn't accept that. A philosopher might pretend that everything he or she is accepting is based on reason. I think the better distinction is that so the distinction he's making is that philosopher accept everything based on reason. And theologian, even though she also uses reason, she explicitly accepts a lot of things based on her authority. I think philosophers also accept a lot of things based on authority. Maybe not as explicitly as a theologian. And maybe some philosophers have pretended that they start from a blank slate, but I think the history of philosophy itself rejects and refutes this claim. So that can't be the real distinction, really. I think the distinction is the philosopher rejects that revelation as a legitimate authority. On the other hand, theologian accept revelation as a legitimate authority. On the other hand, philosopher as well as theologians, they both accept authorities. Maybe their authorities are different, but there are authorities. The authority of, depending on your type of philosophy and your method, but you always have authorities. You always have background assumptions. Maybe another distinction might be that philosopher claims that he can, in principle, question any authority. And you can say that maybe theologian can't say that, and that's true. But I think it's only when theologian establish the authority of that authority based on reason and realizes that that authority must not be questioned because of its ontological and theological position and epistemological position, then that becomes a legitimate authority based on that legitimation in the first place. So that point would apply only to those theologians who think that they accept authority without reason, and who think that faith is somehow something which doesn't have reason as its basis. Okay. Now, the introduction of dialectic in theology, dialectic logic, I guess. The practice of starting from a revealed premise or from revealed premises and arguing rationally to a conclusion leads to the development of scholastic theology. That's in the Christian theology. So it accepts certain revealed premises as their starting point, as axioms or postulates. But so does a lot of philosophy. And you start from revealed premises as axioms or postulates because you have already, in one way or another, established the legitimacy of those premises, of the source of those premises. It can't be arbitrary starting points. So in that sense, then, philosophy and theology, their difference is in their initial premises, and not in the fact that one uses reason and the other doesn't use reason, etc. Or one uses reason absolutely and other uses reason conditionally. But it doesn't turn theology into philosophy. Fine. That's because their premises are different, not because one uses reason or the other doesn't use reason. Since the principles, the data are accepted as revealed. But you also, in one way or another, also establish the legitimacy of that revelation as well, for sure. So then the distinction according to this conception becomes only relative, really. For instance, the theologian may attempt with the aid of categories and forms of reasoning borrowed from philosophy to understand a little better the mystery of the Trinity, but that doesn't thereby cease to act as a theologian, since all the time he accepts the dogma of the Trinity of person in one nature on the authority of God revealing. But hasn't he or she established the legitimacy of that revelation coming from God in the first place or not? If it hasn't, then obviously it's not even acceptable as a faith, let alone philosophy. But if he or she has established the legitimacy of the source of that revelation and the legitimacy of the transmission of that revelation, then that's as good as philosophy, as far as I can see. It is for him a datum or principle, a revealed premise accepted on faith. But this dichotomy between faith and reason itself should be questioned. For sure, faith is something, faith, if you're talking about Imani, but faith must rely on some sort of reasons too. Otherwise, it's a blind faith, which is unacceptable in theology as well as philosophy. Revealed premise accepted on faith, not the conclusion of a philosophical argument. That depends on what philosophical argument is. I mean, if you think that philosophical arguments start from a blank slate, then you are mistaken. Every philosophical argument accepts a lot of axioms based on, as given, that's what faith is. What else is faith? So I think that doesn't. So anyway, I'm trying to take this argumentation as far as it can go. Doesn't mean that I agree with everything I'm saying. Again, while the philosopher starts from the world of experience and argues by reason, to God. So that would be Aristotle, for example, insofar as he can be known by means of creatures. By means of creatures, I'm not sure. By means of reason. The theologian start with God as he has revealed himself. The God doesn't reveal himself. God reveals his revelation, isn't it? But you would first need to make sure that there is a God and there is a revelation and there is a connection between the true God and true revelation. So how can you establish that except for some sort of reason? And the natural method in theology is to pass from God to in himself to creatures. What does he mean by natural? Not sure, because as far as I can see, Aquinas starts from actually experience as well. And as far as ilm kalam is concerned, it starts from what exists. That's why mutakallimin are big on establishing the reality of facts. So they start with rejecting sophists and skeptics, because they know that, because they rely on cosmological argument for establishing the veracity of God or the existence of God. So you can't experience. So philosophers start with experience, argue from there by reason to God, as far as he can be known by it. But the theologian, on the other hand, start with God himself, in the sense that he starts with revelation. Now, even if there are theologians, and for sure there are theologians who start with God, they must somehow establish that this God is the true God, and this revelation is true revelation coming from true God. So they must use reason as well, even if they don't start with experience. But experience can also include the experience of encountering revelation directly, or as transmitted through contingent chains of transmissions. So that can't be the real distinction. And the second thing is, a lot of theologians, for example, Aquinas himself, in many of his arguments, start with experience. And Muslim mutakallimin, the practitioners of kalam, a lot of them start with experience. In fact, because they rely on cosmological argument that's their pet argument. So to use cosmological argument, you have to first, that's why they first start with rejecting skeptics and sophists, because they think that sophists are skeptics who don't believe in the reality of facts, because from the facts they establish God, because cosmological argument doesn't work without facts. So that doesn't seem to be the necessary or sufficient distinction between a theologian and a philosopher. Okay, so he has revealed himself in the natural method. By natural, probably he means logical method in theology. It's passed from God himself to creatures, rather than to ascend from creatures to God. We are creatures, so we even when we receive revelation, we receive it as creatures. Unless we are ourselves prophet, a prophet is still a creature. as the philosopher does and must do. It follows from that the principal difference. Now here, the principal difference between theology lies in the fact that theologian receives his principles as revealed and considers the object with which he deals as revealed or as deducible from what is revealed, whereas the philosopher apprehends his principle by reason alone. They might claim that, but a lot of principles are based on background assumptions. So how are they different from reasons? That's my point all along. Consider the object with which he deals not as revealed, okay, but as apprehensible and apprehended by natural light of reason. What is natural light of reason? I mean, natural light of reason, whenever we talk about natural light of reason, if we think that this natural is totally, I mean, supernatural and natural are qualitatively different, but that doesn't mean that supernatural is not penetrated into natural and that natural cannot exist with and that natural cannot exist with supernatural without supernatural. So the whole concept of natural light of reason already assumes that nature and supernatures, natural and supernatural, are totally divorced, which for us is just an assumption, another assumption really. And if we reject this assumption of this divorce between natural and supernatural, then the natural light of reason, the whole concept collapses. In other words, the fundamental difference between theology and philosophy does not lie in a difference of object concretely considered. Some truths are proper to theology since they cannot be known by reason. So how are they known then? Reason is always involved. Even when we are receiving revelation, at least we know we have to make sure that it is true revelation. Second, we have to use reason to at least understand it. We can't understand it without relating it to our contingent surroundings. So, and are known only by revelation. The mystery of the so once you establish the veracity of revelation, then you might accept a lot of things which you don't fully understand. That's something else, but there is a justification for that within reason in the first place. The mystery of Trinity, for example, while other truths are proper to philosophy alone in the sense that they have not been revealed, but there are some truths which are common to both theology and philosophy since they have been revealed, though at the same time they can be established by reason. So there are things which can be established by reason and there are things which cannot be established by reason. So what are those things? So there are things which can be established by reason which cannot be established by reason. So philosophy has all the things which can be established by reason, but religion or theology have some things which can be established by reason, something which cannot be established by reason. So these things probably are common between philosophy and theology, but those things are excluded. But again, what do we mean by established by reason? Necessary, sufficient. So something can be established by reason only necessarily, the other thing sufficiently, And the third option is both necessarily and sufficiently. So even like Trinity, for example, for a Christian, established by reason in the sense that there's a rational justification for believing it, because you think that God has revealed the truth and that God is a true God, and this truth is coming from that God, so it cannot be false. So, and if that God has, if that God has revealed Trinity, then it is established by reason. Okay, we missed all this. We have to go back. So, for example, a philosopher argues to I think we missed a lot of it here. For example, while the truths are proper to philosophy alone, the mystery, for example, while other truths are proper to in something they have not been revealed, but there are some truths which are common to both theology and philosophy, since they have been revealed. Though at the same time, they can be established by reason. So we already discussed that. It is the existence of these common truths which make it possible to say that theology and philosophy differ primarily because each science considers different truths. In some instances, they consider the same truths, though they consider them in a different manner. Okay, the theologian considering them as revealed, the philosopher as conclusion of a process of human reason. Okay, so method is different. For example, the philosopher argues to God as creator, while the theologian also treats of God as creator, but for philosopher, the knowledge of God as creator comes as a conclusion of a purely rational argument. That's a claim of purely rational arguments. Philosophy itself, history of philosophy itself rejects the existence of purely rational argument, because we always start with a premise, with background assumptions. And as long as we are human, we can't start with a blank slate. While theologian accepts the fact that God is creator from revelation. But doesn't he need to first make sure that that revelation is from God? And how can he ensure that unless he accepts the existence of God independently of that revelation? That's the main point. So that it is for him a premise rather than a conclusion. So as I said, not all theologians, even in Christian tradition, do that. And certainly a lot of Mutakallim would consider this as a contradictory statement, because you can start, once you start with God as a premise, then you are no longer in Ilmul Kalam, you are already in religious sciences, so-called proper, rather than a conclusion. So Mutakallimin all start with their experience of their surrounding as a premise, and from there they argue for a conclusion, and God for them is a conclusion. So I don't know, and I'm sure a lot of Christian theologians are like that, especially Aquinas. So it's a bit strange that Copleston is saying that, but we'll see. A premise which is not hypothetical, a premise which is not hypothetically assumed but revealed. So if you're starting from God as a premise, you can start from God as a premise, but only if that premise is already established. Otherwise, how can you believe in a God without any reason or without any evidence? And if you say that revelation itself is an evidence, but then the question would be, what is the evidence for the veracity of revelation? And that would lead to a and infinite regress. So I think this, so far as I can see, this distinction doesn't stand, but we'll keep looking at it, okay, in the next session, inshallah.